We'll need a bigger stage next year. Holy cow. Welcome, everybody. We're gonna bring it home this year to the 2023 media panel. As we've alluded to, we had to skip last year. The weather didn't cooperate, and so we had to skip last year. So we're doubling up this year with an amazing panel. So it's been a great conference. As everybody said, we've had some great presentations, and this is a great opportunity for us to really bring this together. So I think to start it off, we'll jump right in. I'd love to have everybody, we'll go down the line here and introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself, and if you could share a memorable moment covering weather or how you experienced weather with the group. And I'm sure we could probably spend half a day just on that topic, but if you want to start, Jamie, that'd be great. We'll go down the line.
Jamie Rome, Deputy Director, National Hurricane Center. So many great moments. I don't know if I could pick out one. Ian's being the most recent.
Hi, my name is Matthew Cappucci. I work for the MyRadar app. I do Fox 5 in DC. I work for the Washington Post, do NPR and a couple others. I think my most memorable moment was when I started TV. The first day, we had a tornado go right up the National Mall, and so I didn't have like a normal introduction. It was literally like wall-to-wall tornado coverage.
I'm Jim Ledoux. I got two affiliations. One is I'm the instructor of warning decision making in the National Weather Service, and I'm also an acting director of the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program. And I don't know, there's so many experiences I've had. I live in Norman, Oklahoma, so the experiences seem to come to our front door of late. And the last one was about a mile away from a tornado in February, which almost hit the Weather Center there, which is about the 6th time we've seen tornadoes from the Weather Center. I'll pick to you.
My name is Amy Freeze. I am with Fox Weather. I host a show in the mornings called Weather Command. Fox Weather started up 2 years ago, and so it's been great to be a part of that program. But over the last 30 years, I've worked in 5 top 40 television markets. So we could run the gamut, I think, of different types of coverage from coast to coast, from ice storms in the Pacific Northwest to tornadoes on the Colorado Plains and hurricanes on the East Coast. But I think when I read the agenda for this, the thing that popped into my head first about a weather moment that stands out to me, it was way before I became a meteorologist, and it wasn't like I was a kid looking up at the sky. It was actually my first job in TV. I was an entertainment reporter, and part of the assignment was to go to LA and do the junkets, and I was covering a movie called The Hurricane, which starred Denzel Washington. It has nothing to do with hurricanes, by the way. It was like a fighter or something in it. And right before the interview, it had been raining a couple of days in LA, and everybody went to the window because there was a rainbow. And so I'm watching this rainbow with Denzel Washington. It says, isn't it crazy? After all the storms, something so beautiful happens. And that's really what stood out to me. There's so many things in weather that can be destructive and terrible, but the silver linings are the payoff.
Morning, everyone. Rick Knabb. The years have turned into decades for me, either issuing forecasts at the Hurricane Center or working on new products and warnings and training and briefing emergency managers or being on the Weather Channel, as I have been now this second time around for the last 6-7 hurricane seasons. But my most memorable storms are the personal ones, both in Southwest Florida, Ian, where my uncle's home was flooded, and he was told ahead of time he didn't need flood insurance and he's not going to be able to rebuild. And Charlie in 2004, where my grandmother narrowly escaped in a mobile home because a friend who was supposed to come get her didn't pick her up. And the next year, when Wilma approached, I went down Alligator Alley and got her out of her mobile home myself. And that was when I realized that all the forecasts and warnings and evacuation instructions aren't the entire solution. We have 2 big problems. Some people refuse to get out. Other people can't get out. And we have to do everything we can in both cases to get everybody out.
I'm actually glad Dr. Knabb brought that up. My name is Matt Devitt. I'm the chief meteorologist of Wink News, and recently I did a story. I went to San Carlos Island, which is right before you get on Fort Myers Beach, and I talked to a local, and this woman had been here for Charlie, and she had been here for Ian, and I said, how high did the water get during Charlie? She pointed at her ankle. I said, well, how about this time with Ian? She pointed above her head. And the storm surge that we experienced with Ian in Southwest Florida was something that we had never experienced since at least 1850. So without a doubt, Ian is my most notable storm.
Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Eric Salna. I did television weather for over 25 years, and I purposely left TV weather to get more into weather education and research. And that brought me to Florida International University, where I'm the Associate Director of Education and Outreach for all the work that we do there with the research and the wall of wind. But thinking about a hurricane memory, for me, Hurricane Andrew came to mind. I had just gotten hired in Fort Myers. I was working in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was a hurricane virgin, and here came Andrew. But being in Southwest Florida and then seeing, how devastating a Category 5 can be to a community, and how Southwest Florida had to prepare for a time being as well. So that was the one that came to my mind. And I purposely wore the flash socks for this presentation as well.
Hi, my name is Erica Lopez. I'm a bilingual meteorologist for MyRadar, and I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so my most memorable weather memory is right before I went to school. So I went to school at the University of Oklahoma. It was like 2 months before I was going to move, and there was actually a windstorm that went through my small town. I'm from Ennis, Texas, if any of you know where that is. There's a Buc-ee's there. And so I remember, I had no idea, I knew I loved weather, but I didn't know how communication was so important for a small community. It was a windstorm that really made damage across our small town. We just have one main street. It's grown a lot since, but that windstorm, it took us 10 years, I think a decade to, it damaged a lot of our brick buildings that are downtown, and it took us 10 years to get back up to normal for our small little town. And I always think back to that memory because I didn't know much about meteorology before I came into the field, at least in terms of, in a scientist perspective, but I always think about that windstorm that, for a small town, it was impactful for us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Garcia. I'm the Chief Meteorologist of Fox 29 San Antonio, also the Director of the National Tropical Weather Conference and the CEO of the Storm Science Network. If we think back of hurricane memories, mine has to go way back when I was a kid. I'm old enough to remember Hurricane Carla. I lived through that. I was living in Victoria, Texas at the time, and the eye passed just to the east of Victoria, and I have a tremendous number of memories of the storm as it was coming through. The wind, I can still hear it today. The creaking of the buildings, I can still hear today. I still remember all the men running down to the end of the hall of the school where we were sheltering, not knowing what it was all about. Finding out the next day, all the men were holding the doors so they wouldn't blow out. If they had, that building where we were in wouldn't be there. I also remember going down to Port Lavaca the day after and seeing seaweed up on the high electrical lines. That's how high the seawater got, blowing all that seaweed up there, 20, 30 feet up. And memories of walking out and my dad telling me, don't touch anything, because there was jewelry, money, anything you could ever imagine was all over the ground. That's my memory, and of course, that's what spurred me on. Hey, I got to get into this.
I feel like, Alex, we're in another room. You're so far away down there, so thank you. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I think we want to dive into technology a little bit. Yesterday we had a great presentation, Rick and Sarvesh, talking about AI, and I think it's something we wanted to touch back on. I thought maybe I'd start with Jamie and Rick. Just your thoughts on AI, how the impact it could have on forecasting public information. And an editorial comment, I just want to comment, is the former director of the Hurricane Center and the current director, you all do an amazing job. It is a tough, I can't imagine a major hurricane bearing down on a big city. You have to make these decisions and all this dynamic situation to evacuate, not evacuate. It is some high stakes poker. So
Well, I did it for 10 months and said that's enough and went back to deputy. Rick actually stuck around for a little while, so kudos for him.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I'm going to probably tell you the most shocking thing about AI and Hurricane Center is not new to us at all. We've been using it for quite a long time. Now, There's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of buzz. People want to talk about it. But the Hurricane Center has been using AI. It's one of the reasons why, and people don't, and you've heard me give my spiel, stop looking at the dang models. Why? Because we have AI that is constantly learning the biases of those models and correcting them for the forecasters. And then the forecasters are adding even more value added on top of that. So by showing people the models or focusing one's coverage on the models, you're actually degrading the information. So we've been using AI. It's gotten much more sophisticated. You could argue a deeper version of AI more recently with our modern corrected consensus approaches. But I'll let Rick jump in now.
Well, there's, as Jamie says, a lot that's been done in the weather world for a long time, and I think the Hurricane Center has been for a long time a leader in using what is now more popularly called AI. I don't think we ever used that term in the hallways.
We called it coding.
Yeah, or a new algorithm or a new forecaster tool, right? But I am, on this topic, I'm constantly drawn beyond the meteorology to the information that the public is getting with regard to what home to buy or rent, whether or not to get flood insurance, whether or not they should evacuate. There's going to be, as there are already today, a lot of different sources of information from both humans and computers trying to behave like humans. Both cases, some are accurate, some are inaccurate. Some are good advice, some's bad advice. Some is fed with reliable information, some is not. And I think this community, as we said the other day, is going to have a lot to do with engaging with all the different human and pseudo-human sources of information going forward to make sure that the right data is feeding those algorithms, feeding that AI, and that people are getting reliable, good advice on things like whether or not to be insured for flood, whether or not that home is a safe place to buy a home or is built strong or not.
So along those lines, the rest of the panel, it came up yesterday, the whole concept, and we're all painfully aware of the fake information that goes on social media. Someone will post 300 plus hours out of Cat 5, and they go, Mexico, we're going to kill everybody. There was a TikTok, somebody did talking about a Cat 6 hurricane that got, a trillion views. It's crazy. Are you worried that AI could ultimately feed into that? As more people get access to that, they're just going to continue to post fake information that's going to get passed around, that's going to confuse people, because that's part of the issue, right? How do we convey?
Well, that's a human-generated problem.
Right, right.
And I'll offer a different solution, that AI might be able to help us weed it out or identify it as erroneous or bad or flag it. So I'm not scared of AI from that perspective. I think it's a great tool that we can use because the posting of sloppy information is a human-generated problem. Maybe computers have made it easier to do it, like a 5-year-old can do it now versus it used to be you needed a little bit of sophistication. But I don't know.
But I'm concerned about who generates the information that feeds an AI system, what's the data going into it, and what are their biases in creating it. AI can be just as reliable or unreliable as humans can be. So I think we're going to have the same problems whether it's an actual human or an AI.
Matt, you're the old guy on the panel this year. And any thoughts? I know you're crazy active in social media, multi-platform. You're out there creating tons of content. Any thoughts on that from your side?
I think for me, it's always a battle of whether or not we want to correct someone else's bad information or spend our time putting out good information. And there's not really a good answer to that. If we spent our time, trying to weed out all the rubbish out there, we'd have no time whatsoever to do good forecasts. So I think it's about trying to establish oneself as credible. You never want to shame people for buying information that's not good, because a lot of people out there don't know how to be savvy shoppers of information. I think you have to sort of expose someone's, lack of qualifications, or I shouldn't say that. You sort of have to point out why information is bad, and then say, hey, let's show you what's wrong. We'll take you to get better information. And I think in doing so, you earn over their trust, and then they stick to you as a source. So ultimately, you want to be their one trusted voice, or show them at least where they can find trusted voices, whether it be the Hurricane Center, government officials, etc. But you have to teach them to be savvy shoppers.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good points. So, everybody up here, you've all demonstrated expertise in, discussing resilience and trying to promote that to your viewers and to the people you work with. Just curious, what have you found that's effective? Do you think you're getting more opportunity to talk about resilience and education? And I'm going to start with Amy and then with Erica, of course, on the Espanol side. Just curious your thoughts on that, and we'll move around the panel.
The opportunities at Fox Weather to talk about resilience are pretty numerous because our platform is a fast stream channel. So we basically have an endless availability of time to talk about a variety of things. And the way we're running a lot of days is event-based programming. So what that means is that if there's an event, say it's a hurricane, we are doing the before, the during, and the after. And a lot of times we break that down into phases or time periods. So if the event itself is happening, we'll go 6 hours before, 6 hours during, and 6 hours after. And then we break that out also on a broader scale, leading up to a hurricane season, what's happening during it and after hurricane season, watching the follow through. So resilience is becoming a big part of that story, and it's getting deeper and deeper, the conversation, instead of just the resiliency of how do you build your community back after everything was devastated, just in a couple days' time, get yourself back on your feet and your lights back on. It's talking more and more about how do you change the way your structure is, how do you change the way your boundaries are in your proximity to danger. Those types of conversations are happening more than ever before. And I spent the previous 20 some odd years working in local, which is a much different time frame where you're constrained to 3 or 4 minutes, and it's just talking about a local forecast. So our platform is really dipping into some of those things and broadening horizons, which creates information for people. If the storm's not happening at their house, they're able to see what's happening to someone else through the phases, and then they can start to apply that to their own life. I think that's valuable.
Erica?
Yeah, so, I'm lucky in the fact that MyRadar gives me a great platform to do more of Spanish forecasting, which when I started in the field about 5 years ago, I knew a handful of people who knew how to speak Spanish and communicate Spanish language information to other communities. Now there's so many students that have graduated that have there's more information out there for Spanish, and I feel like that's such a great way to move forward in terms of resiliency. Now there's more Spanish information, I think, in, even thinking about when I grew up, because I grew up just speaking Spanish. My mom only speaks Spanish, and I don't really remember much, about the information. I've never seen pamphlets in Spanish for weather. I'm in a very active Dallas-Fort Worth area, and, for a Spanish-speaking community, there were Spanish speakers there, but they were in charge of a lot of the country back then, and so I'm very lucky into the fact that MyRadar lets us expand, use our skill set to give out more information in a digital platform. I've only been there for about 1.5 years, and we've been testing so many new things on how to reach people online. And I think, especially now that we're thinking more in terms of social media, like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, one of our YouTube videos did very well, and not just in the US. This YouTube video is specifically for a hurricane that was making landfall in Mexico, Hillary. It was aiming for Baja California Sur, and they did receive a lot of impacts there. And the comments, they were like, "Thank you so much for the information. We had no idea this was happening." And these are people who lived in the area. So being able to give them the information and showing them how, and seeing the comments on how it helped them prepare for the storm, I think says a lot to resiliency. And hopefully moving forward, we can reach more of those communities, not just in the US, but communities like Mexico, in terms of, when there's going to be impactful weather, especially hurricanes over that area.
And I'm wondering, maybe I'll throw this to Eric with his giant wall of wind down there. I think what seems to resonate with people? I mean, I immediately think of your videos and homes getting blown up and everything like that, but I'm just curious your thoughts from where you sit. What works? Is there anything magic? Where could we do better? Just curious.
I think communication is a big one that I think about a lot, especially when I talk about weather. I think it's easy for us as meteorologists to get down into the science, and these are communities that maybe in Mexico don't have like a specific meteorologist like we do in the US. I think the US has so many great areas that have community meteorologists, the ones that are there, the ones that they trust, and I don't see that as much in other countries, for example in Mexico. And so I think Seeing that and, you know, that kind of perspective of, oh, here's the information that we need, and there's the person that is going to give it to us, and hopefully building more of a following in terms of that kind of, you know, reaching those communities.
And then Eric, are you, what looking ahead, aside from blowing things up, what else do you have in the plans to continue to increase the messaging that everybody in this panel can use to get the message out on resilience? Just curious what you're thinking of.
Well, I think what's been interesting with the wall of wind, it's attracted media ever since I've been there. And I think that has now been that entry into this whole topic of stronger building codes, resilience, and then my recommendations to folks in television, you put, you know, many markets and hurricane markets put together the 30-minute hurricane specials, but why don't you cover this? You know, this is another topic for you to cover. And so when it comes to protecting your home and all your window coverings and the windows and the doors and the garage door, you know, and what are the building codes in your local community? So I think the wall of wind has opened that conversation for a lot of media that has come, you know, and then we kind of share those thoughts so they can bring that back and put it into their stories. So that's been a great thing. And moving forward, obviously, I mentioned we have the big vision, the big facility that's, if everything goes as timed out, 5 years down the road or so, when we're going to get even a larger facility up to 200 miles an hour, and then bring in the water component and talk about wave action and storm surge and the dangers of storm surge. So that new facility will, you know, bring in those other hazards into the conversation, but to see it firsthand, you know, the visual, and to show the public what wind and then eventually what water can do, hoping that'll be very impactful in getting the public to understand it.
And I'm just curious to open this up to the panel. You know, we've all seen some amazing presentations during the conference, and we have an amazing resource out here in the audience. Just curious, what can they provide to help you? I know that, you know, it's always about information, being the trusted source. You know, we talked about, we have other platforms now, whether it's TikTok, YouTube, or whatever, so there are other opportunities. So I'm just curious, you know, from our standpoint up here, down there, any thoughts on what, you know, how can they help? Is there anything that you need, anything you're not getting related to the resilience messaging? So just curious. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, I would say that show and tell is important. That's what we do in television, is we show and tell. So, but to show and tell a different type of wall material, or to show and tell screws that are different, this doesn't translate for television so much. But if you show us what you want us to show and you tell us what you want us to tell, then it becomes easier for us to execute that that product and that story to someone. So as you're thinking of things and how you want to tell your story, if you think of it in a show and tell format, that really is the easiest way to get it translated onto television. If you want something done, do it yourself. So if you'd like to see your story about your product or what resiliency you can bring to communities, think about how you would tell that story, and that is the way you present it to different types of platforms. That's why your social media is incredibly important that you put out there, because these are some of the things that we are looking to just think, how can we show and tell a story about more durable walls? It doesn't seem very interesting at face value, but if all of a sudden we can take it and test it and show what it can do, that is amazing for us. If we can look at a place that the home got completely blown off its foundation, but there's now a new, sturdier home in place that is ready for the next storm, and we tell the story of the person that lived there, those are beautiful stories that allow us to help people believe in resiliency in their own life. So that's one thing I would encourage. Remember, show and tell.
Jimmy?
I would say make your information actionable and consumable. So just to like put myself through, so during COVID, nobody could get contractors, right? So I had to kind of become the primary person to maintain my house. So I kind of know my way around my house, okay. And I read some outreach material, and one of the recommendations was to make sure your home is well engineered. And I thought to myself, how would I do that?
Right.
Do I go look? Is there a seal? Is there a certification? Do I go kick the door and make sure it doesn't? Do I call someone? That bullet sounds great, but it's not actionable by a reasonable, ordinary human being that you would meet on the street. Make it actionable. Is there a website? Is there? Right. Doesn't see? Make it so when I read something, I go do something. That's how you penetrate.
Very good. Anybody else?
I'll add to that that it needs to be very directly relatable and personal. And that's why I think, if I think back to the most effective segments that I've ever done on the Weather Channel that have to do with resilience, it's when I brought on, a lot of times with Flash's help, a homeowner, a person who had been there and done that, and who had either been through a bad experience and they shared with us what they did to make things better when they rebuilt, or someone who took some steps that were more affordable than you might think. And I think in those cases, the viewer can say, okay, so that's just a person who has a house, who is concerned about their family safety, is concerned about affordability of what they're doing. Wow, I think I can actually do that. And then, yes, you need to know who you call, what site you go to, what app you download, what do you sign up for, so that someone can not just watch a segment and go, wow, that's cool, maybe I can do that someday, and then go, no, it's too complicated, it's too expensive. Somewhere to go to quickly do it and turn it into action.
Very good. I think those are all really great points. I wanted to talk a bit about Hurricane Ian, and we've talked a lot about it, or major hurricanes in general. Pretty much everybody up here has had some part in either covering it, communicating it, researching it. And I think would love to hear your thoughts on, if there is one biggest takeaway from covering it or researching it. And also, where could we do better? Is there information that's lacking? We talk a lot about the before, during, and after. Where can we fill in the gaps? Can people in the audience help us that way? I think there's a lot to discuss there. And Matt, I'll start with you, seeing as you talked about this yesterday, and you were here. But then I'd love to hear from others on the panel about that. And it doesn't have to be Ian. And we've all covered storms, and we'll be covering storms, coming up. So,
interestingly enough, Irma, which was 5 years before Ian, I think in many ways had a significant impact on Southwest Florida. And we know what happened with Irma. Irma, for a time, after it was turning north from Cuba, was, for a time supposed to narrow in on Sanibel, Captiva. Worst part of the storm would have been the Tamiami Trail, I-75 corridor, our most densely populated, from Marco Island to Naples, Fort Myers Beach. And what happened was, at the last minute, it took a shift to the east. And it took that worst storm surge to a more sparsely populated area, Everglades City, and areas that did see bad surge, but not in our most populated areas. So what happened with a lot of my locals and a lot of my viewers is they felt that, and not all, but some, that they felt it was a case where you said we were going to have X amount of surge in Cape Coral, Fort Myers Beach, and Sanibel, and then it didn't happen. Well, then I would say, well, good, you got to keep your house. That's awesome. That's fantastic. But I think what happened was people made the mistake of comparing what happened with Irma and thinking that that was going to happen with Ian. And, and I'm not saying all, but for some, did that impact the way that they treated the storm? Potentially. And I think that they paid the price in potentially more ways than one. And we can't, fall into this case of where we compare storms from the past and go into the future. I had noted Charlie. Charlie had a lot of similarities to Ian, but they were two completely different storms. Charlie was fast and it was small. Ian was big and it was slower. So that is one of the mistakes that a lot of my locals, and these are highly populated areas. In my viewing area, Cape Coral is the most populated. And although they may have done better with Irma, they felt every bit of Ian. And I know that that's a mistake that they will not make again in the future.
Yep, absolutely.
You can build on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, so Ian taught us the same lesson all over again. It just hit harder because I happened to be the captain of the ship that day. There is a remarkable opportunity right after a storm, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, where people who have no interest in weather suddenly want to learn. And we're filling that space with the wrong narrative. We have this remarkable opportunity to teach people who are hungry to be taught. They ignore us the rest of the year. We're just dorky scientists and engineers. But for those 2, 3, 4 days immediately after storm, everybody's anxious to learn. And what did we teach them after Ian? The cone sucks. We didn't teach them about building codes. We didn't teach them about resiliency. We didn't energize them to protect themselves versus expecting the government to do it for you. We wasted yet another opportunity to prepare the nation for the next one, talking about the cone.
I'll say one thing about that. At Fox Weather, this is something that challenges us that we want to approach in a better way. And we returned to Fort Myers on June 1st, the beginning of hurricane season, spent a couple of days there. And I think the one takeaway from Ian for me was, as we often find, really devastating storms can change a place forever. You know, one storm can change everything. It can change everything in a personal life, it can change everything in a community, and it's never gonna look the same. People who died, they're not, that's it, that's the bottom. Communities that are scraped, that's the scrape. It's gonna be changed forever. And so we have to be okay with that in the way that we approach it with people after the storm, that there are answers for them, and that things can be better, but there are complications that are conversations we should have. Like Fort Myers building back, there are building codes, there are ways to do it better, but there are also richer people that are gonna come in and do that in a different way. Those are stories that need to be told and need to be had across the board. And I do think it's important that people hear those stories right after the storm happens, because their attention is the most that it's going to be. This is when they're leaning in for that information. And so capitalizing on those moments is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity that we have to remember, and we have to constantly be reminding ourselves, instead of living off of the drama of the pictures, which is often the medium that we're in, is finding opportunities to bring those conversations in that are truly impactful for people. Being okay with that the storm has changed your community forever. There are possibilities on how it could be better, but also there are massive challenges that can make it so that people could maybe never return to their home again. Don't leave those conversations off the table. Those are important.
And if I can jump in real quick,
Absolutely.
to Jamie's point of memory, it comes to my mind with Hurricane Irma. Right afterwards, the media went down to the Keys. And you know, it's typical. They're going to set up a live shot, and behind the journalist, maybe something that's all destroyed and blown apart. For example, you know, some of those mobile homes destroyed and blown apart. That's the visual. But I did see one journalist, a few days after Irma. You know, that was the big story. There were success stories in the Keys because of the strength of the building code. And there was one reporter that actually panned the camera over and said, look at this building. There's very little damage because of the building code. So I think that was in the time frame you're talking about.
For a beer. And the reason being is because society no longer rewards good behavior. You're rewarded for bad behavior in society. What do we peddle after a disaster? Complete failure. The government failed, everybody failed, this failed, right? That's what sells. There are so many successes after Ian that have never been told. There are so many successes, and the woman responsible was right there in the red dress. I can remember a day where, Rick, you can remember this day, when a Cat 3 in that spot of the world, the rule of thumb for evacuation was elevated by one Saffir-Simpson category and pull the mom. That would have resulted in over 1 million people being evacuated from the Tampa Bay area. How many people were evacuated from the Tampa Bay area? It was a surgical, precise evacuation like one I've never seen before. That is a remarkable success, but nobody's telling that story. Those people are going to be better prepared for the next storm because we didn't unnecessarily evacuate them. Those are the stories we have. We have to celebrate the successes and not wallow in the failures.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah, I agree with you 100%.
And another success along those lines was the evacuation that was called in this area for Idalia, even though it was passing way to the west, the eye was. And that's another example. You got to focus on location-specific, hazard-specific information and what the local officials are saying about that, and not focus on where the storm itself is going as much as we focus on what's going to happen where you live. And the things that I've talked about the most since Ian, and I did spend some time in the immediate aftermath correcting the notion that the Fort Myers was outside the cone and that getting rid of the cone would solve the problem, which it won't. There will always be a track depiction. There will always be storm-specific information out there. But going back to hazard-specific, location-specific information, as much work as we all did on the storm surge warning and as many lives as I am sure it has already saved, it doesn't solve the whole problem. We got to make that storm surge warning a lot more famous. A lot more people know what a tornado warning is and a tornado watch is than know what a storm surge warning and a storm surge watch are. We've got to keep making that more famous, more prominent in our television coverage. Even more emergency managers need to know what those storm surge products need. There's a reason why the Hurricane Center has and will continue to train emergency managers in the off season, because you got to keep getting updated with the new stuff. But even with a perfect forecast, a perfect warning, and perfectly placed and timed evacuation instructions, as I mentioned in the opening, it still doesn't solve the whole problem. And one of the problems in Ian was lack of evacuation compliance among some, and lack of evacuation assistance for others. We have to do more to get everybody out. Just as one quick illustration of that would be when, after a hurricane, you see the cavalry of power restoration trucks coming from other states coming into the area. And that's a great thing. That needs to be done. Power restoration is critical. Can't we have as many evacuation buses coming into vulnerable communities to get people out ahead of time? If they are medically vulnerable, otherwise need transportation, need to be taken to a place where the health care will be what they're getting at home. So healthcare organizations, transportation companies, emergency managers, all of us need to do more to get everybody out, while we're also pleading with convincing the people who refuse to get out to go.
To Dr. Knapp's point, the greatest population of people that lost their lives, it was people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s during Ian, and it was drowning.
And that goes back to Katrina. It goes back to Sandy and so many other storms.
Yeah.
We're not doing well by our elderly and health vulnerable citizens.
Yeah.
And I'll just say on the evacuation topic, which could be a whole other topic we could talk about. I remember Irma. I had relatives down in this area that evacuated to Atlanta, and they were elderly. They became part of the vulnerable. They weren't when they left, but it took them 40 hours. They ran out of gas. They didn't know where to go. It was a real nightmare. And some of them ended up in the hospital, so then the next time they're like, we're just not leaving, so I think there's so many facets to all of this, right, like you were saying, in buses.
We have to, as a community, we have to push through that and explain risk, okay? And if not, what just happened in Acapulco is going to happen here. And if you think that sort of rapid intensification right on your doorstep can't happen in this basin, I'm telling you it can. We always have to evacuate based off whether you call it a worst case, semi-worst case, reasonable upper bound, something, right? It's something above the explicit deterministic forecast to account for this uncertainty. That means that after the fact, there are always going to be people who are pissed off, right? That's why we have to take advantage of that critical 2, 3, 4 days after the storm to explain that, explain risk and vulnerability to them. And we're not doing that. We're missing a great opportunity to explain why we have to evacuate more than actually get impacted.
Excellent point. I want to talk a little bit about Idalia and the discussion of wind speed information and what's being projected. You know, what's being measured, what's being put out versus what's actually measured at landfall and the discrepancies. I know, James, you're passionate about this. Dr. Forrest Masters, who's typically here, talks about this a lot. You know, trying to take that data and how do we communicate it in an effective way. So I'll start with you, James. Your thoughts on that? Is it that way all the time? Is there something we should be doing differently? Would it just make things more confusing? So go ahead.
Well, I think, you know, the big thing here is talking about impact-based forecasting. It's like what's going to happen to the people that are receiving the forecasts. You know, so you're converting wind speeds. What does that mean to the various residences that people live in? So if somebody lives in a modular home, does it mean something? What's the probability? Like, is it a really big chance that they may lose their rooftop and therefore lose shelter? Or is it going to be simply, well, some peripheral damage, and they can still ride it out relatively safely? And you know, the same thing can be said, of course, for people living on the coast. You know, what's going to happen to you? And so this is a challenging thing to convert meteorological variables in a forecast to something that's personal. And it's something I think the Weather Service in general wants to go there. They want to talk about how to convey probabilistic information in impact-based forecasts. And so it's not a short order, that's for sure. But I think a successful outcome of that endeavor will make a big difference.
Any other thoughts on the panel?
One of the things I think that can be done, and it is a difficult thing to do, as you say, but if we're talking about wind speeds and we talk about what that wind speed could potentially do, we do this a lot with water. If a couple of inches of water are coming, 6 inches of water can sweep someone off their feet. This type of comparison. And while all of those things can't realistically be done, I think, in every storm for each individual person because it is so personal. If you do start to talk about wind speeds in relation to how they impact people, how it would impact them as a person, how it would float their car, how it might rip shingles off of their roof, if you can start to talk about wind speeds in some relation to what it might do to them, to where they can start visualizing that, 40 miles an hour wind doesn't really mean a lot of things to a lot of people. It means things to us. 65-mile-an-hour winds means things. So when you start to use proper words and comparisons with those measurements, I think that can be an education and a starting point. That way, when our forecasts come out and we're using those wind terms, and if we do get to a point where we're talking about what's in the storm versus what's going to land at their house, that might start to become more visible or visual, a visualization for them so that they can take an action that would follow through. But it is a really difficult thing when you're giving a forecast to give a wind speed, whether it's the one that's coming in or out of the storm or otherwise, and have people really relate to what that means.
The topic of wind observations during Idalia, this was something that was very frustrating for me as well during Ian in Southwest Florida, and it's some of it we can prevent, some of it we can't. You know, anemometers fail, and they obviously need to be powered, and if they lose power, then you're not going to get those peak observations. And, you know, National Hurricane Center will release their advisories, and we know that they have issued those for a reason, but sometimes it's very tricky to get the ground truth to show that to viewers. And we know why they issued the advisory, but whether it be, you know, like for example, in South Florida, I struggle, even now, to this day, sometimes getting reliable information, even on my barrier islands and along the immediate coast. Most of my airports, most of my METARs are inland. And granted, South Florida International Airport hit 110 with a gust during Ian, but that's still 20 minutes from the coast. Recently, and I was celebrating when I found out about it, we had a new METAR site that was added in coastal Charlotte County, but my point being is that, you know, although we only had that gust that you noted in Cedar Key, that doesn't mean that it didn't see wind in that sparsely populated area near the Big Bend. And it's not like a Miami or an Orlando where you have observations all over the place.
Right.
And that's a case that I struggle with in South Florida too, whether it be funding. Can we get more obs so that way we have that ground truth that we can show people that this is what it hit. Now, I had a wind gust to 140 in Cape Coral, and we know that it could have very well been even higher than that, but we don't know that. And then another thing that I will tell you, not even talking about wind observations that I personally experienced during Ian, was about surge. And what we did is, as Ian was approaching and at the height of the storm, we had phoners from people on Fort Myers Beach, and they're calling in and saying water, we had to move to the second floor. Water has completely flooded out our first floor. Where are we at with the surge? Or is it going to continue to rise? Are we maxing out? And I would have looked at those NOAA sensors that we have. We have one along the Caloosahatchee, we have one at the Naples Pier, but even that, I'm limited. The real-time data coming in, I only have 2 in South of Florida. I don't even have 1 in Charlotte County. So I had viewers in Punta Gorda that were asking me, and I couldn't tell them. I had to use Fort Myers as kind of a basis as to where we're at with the surge and what's, is it continuing to climb? Is it going down? Is it getting better? So then that's a case of, do we get the funding for that, and how do we put in more? I think if we build that type of network with greater sensors and greater real-time data, I think that can really pay off in the long run.
Good, man.
I think we need to do a better job, too, of educating folks on sort of the structure inside the hurricane. I think there are a lot of people who, when they think of a hurricane, they think of just this big, sprawling thing 500 miles across, and you're either in it or you're not. And there's so many times people fail to understand that the worst winds are, of course, only within 5-10 miles of the center. I think that's part of the reason, too, why people so often, compare to previous events. They might be 20 miles from the center, see next to nothing in one storm, say, hey, I survived, Charlie, whatever, it had winds to 150, and they'll fail to understand that a subtle shift of 5-10 miles means you're either in the eye wall or you're not. And so anytime I try to post a graphic on social media, I'll even take a satellite image and show, here's where winds will be the worst hazard, here's where surge will be the worst hazard, here's where your number one hazard is flooding rains. But I think people always try to compare to past events, not understanding that it's not just this linear increase in wind inside, it's this very jagged stair-step thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think people understand that when you put those up there? I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead. Do you think that they get that message when you do those graphics?
I think I do think so. I think obviously a lot of people still don't know where they are on a map, but I think at least it shows folks that the buzzsaw of wind is smaller than we expect, and so or smaller than a lot of people expect. And so there are so many times I try to say to folks, like, yes, you got hit by whatever storm, but you weren't in it last time, so to speak. You'll see very different hazards this time because of that subtle shift of 5-10 miles.
Go ahead.
I was about to say, and not only inside or outside versus inside, but also when you're inside that buzzsaw, there's a lot of nuance in there. You could wind up with these microscale disturbances. As you were talking about in Adelia, there was a 5 or 10 foot wide vortex traveling at 80, 90 miles per hour or something like that. And so there is that potential where some people are going to experience worse damage than others in there. So, which means, of course, is that people have to be prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah. And I don't think, just to clarify, anybody who's taken away from this discussion that you think, well, there's some systematic bias in the Hurricane Center's intensities and sizes. I don't think there's any problems with the max sustained winds, the intensity that the Hurricane Center has in their advisories. Although there is some very careful reanalysis after the fact, and those numbers can change. So operational values are front-loaded. You don't have all the information that you would have later, and those get revised. But especially the best track, the final data, I don't think there's a systematic bias, high or low, in those. But there is a dramatic lack of density of in situ observations over the water and on land. And that's why Hurricane Hunter aircraft are sent out there, and those data are carefully analyzed and interpreted to arrive at what the max sustained winds are offshore, what the size of the storm is. And one piece of evidence that those numbers are pretty darn good and Jamie can get more details on this than I can, but the wind structure of the hurricane is what is used to generate the storm surge forecasts and the probabilistic storm surge information and the storm surge warnings, and those have verified really darn well over the years. So if they're being given bad wind information, I don't know how they're pulling out the really good storm surge information. So, so there is, so yeah. But, so I think in general, what the Hurricane Center is producing wind-wise is reliable, but it's limited in detail necessarily because of the lack of density of observations. And it does make for a very challenging forensic exercise after the fact, in both in terms of wind and storm surge, to figure out what happened locally after the fact.
And to help bring that home, all the comments here bring it home, including the in situ observations. How many, I assumed everybody knew this, but then I realized I was wrong. You will never see the peak wind or peak surge measured in an in situ observation. Is that a fair statement?
That is very fair.
How many of you realize that to construct the post-storm report after the event, it's done almost entirely within forensics and surveys, boots on the ground? How many of you, we physically go out and have to measure, Rick's done this with me several times, reconstruct the storm with forensics. So that speaks to the lack of, so don't look to the in situ observations. Right. It's always going to be wrong or incomplete or low. And to Matt's point, to help you understand just how tight the radius of maximum destruction is. You know, remember Laura, right? The surge that disappeared into the swamp somewhere, right? It didn't occur, the surge didn't happen. All right, so sent the survey team in to find the surge. I'm at the mothership, you know, dialing them up from where to go here. The guy calls me and says, we're just not seeing it, Jamie. It's not here. It's six or seven tops. I said, get in the car and drive 1 mile. He's like, you're nuts. I said, get in the car, drive 1 mile. He calls me back and he said, we just measured 15 feet. That's how tight that impact zone can be. Now imagine communicating that to Matt's point. Oh, it wobbles, you know, complete destruction. Wobbles, you're okay. That's a really, really, really hard communication challenge. The expectation that society is going to get that right perfectly, and everybody's going to be happy, I think we're holding ourselves to kind of like a little bit of a bar that might be a little bit like, you know, we have to recognize that it's going to be hard to communicate this both before and after, and people are going to be upset. There's a reason it's called a disaster. It's not fun. It's not good. It's not pleasant. And I guess my argument is we need to stop letting the negative 10% drive how we attack this from a policy perspective.
I wanted to bring up that graphic again.
What was that again?
The graphic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a good segue for the panel to kind of wrap it up. Being this is the 25-year anniversary of Flash, we'd love to hear from everybody. Do you have a prediction or a wish for the next 25 years related to the weather enterprise? Something you'd like to see or something you think we'll see that's going to improve resilience and forecasting and all the things we've talked about up here today. So I'll start with you, Jamie, and go down the line.
You know, there's this current thinking that the public can't understand risk. If we give it to them, they're going to do something stupid. They can't handle it. You know, they're just going to jump off a ledge, you know, whatever. And I think we're not giving people the full breadth of information that they need to be more resilient. I'll give you a case in point. I sat down with a TV station in a major city, I won't tell you which one, and I said if evacuation were ordered right now for this city, can you display the evacuation zones? And they all looked at each other, they were like, do we have them? You have them. No. Do we have them? Do we have them? Do we draw them? Where is it? Do you have it? Does the Hurricane Center have it? That's the most critical life-saving information in a storm. Who is not and who is under an evacuation? And we're not making that data readily available to people. Rick, I mean, you and I have been working on this for 10 years.
You're stealing part of my answer, but it'll be worth saying more than once. But I'll wait.
Matt?
I think that one of the biggest things that we can really work on, especially in the communications side of things, is education. We live in an era where every soundbite in the news is 15, 20 seconds. In the mornings, I have 45 seconds for a weather forecast, which is just not enough time for anything. Social media makes everything little snippets. And I think, especially leading up to disasters, people want that behind the curtain look as to why are decisions being made. How can they make good decisions too? People don't necessarily want to be told what to do. They want to be given the tools to make that decision themselves. But oftentimes they're not quite capable of doing that. So, we sort of need to teach them the process as to why they need to arrive at a decision. Teach them the uncertainty as to why, why is a forecast a little bit iffy? I think being as transparent with what we know and what we don't know and helping them to make the decisions on their own, but sort of, guiding them by making those teachable moments can be helpful.
Absolutely. James?
I think a couple things. We have I'm involved in a very challenging problem of trying to get residents to understand how their buildings are built, how their homes are, and how resistant they are to various hazards. And this is part of a statement we're working on in the American Meteorological Society for people in manufactured housing. And one of the big challenges is, they may understand the forecast and so forth, but translating that to their own personal risk is really hard. And in the severe weather landscape, interior U.S., trying to get them to figure out where their decision matrix is to take action, because in many cases for people it is not in the warning because they need more time to get out, and it may be on the outlook or the watch, or maybe somewhere in between. And I think that, certainly that's really challenging when you're talking about a potential tornado outbreak, because most people are not even going to get hit during an outbreak. But I think that kind of decision-making space also works in the tropical cyclone environment too, because we need to focus on getting them to understand their own residents.
Absolutely. Amy?
For me, for the future, hopes, dreams, whatever, data, 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 data. I wish that every home had a weather station in it. I wish it was something that we put in like a faucet that we could get more data. I think that data leads us to more knowledge and understanding, so that is a hope that I have for the future. Also, that we can find balance in technology and personal information. A lot of people getting their weather information are now putting up barriers. GPS positioning gives us the value that we can tell people what's happening in their area, or maybe give them an alert and warning. Now people can turn those off because they don't want someone to know where they are. They can turn off their location services. So finding a way where we can meet in the middle on critical alert systems, I think that is a big thing in the future. Just allowing people to have the tools that they need, and just being a part of this conference. I think the big thing that is already happening that will pay off in the future is the effort in science to give people hope. When we have research, when we have construction, when we have ways to solve problems, it gives people hope. So when all is lost after a storm and people feel like they're at the bottom of the barrel, when there is an opportunity and a path towards building themselves back up, that really is the best gift that you can give someone in hope. So being here and being part of this, I really think is a huge part of the future.
Well, I hope that in not too many more years, that collectively we are, in our society, as afraid of water as we are of wind, to the point where we do the things for water that we've been doing for wind. For example, getting insured for flood. More people need to choose to get insured for flood, even though they've already made sure they're insured for wind. And it's a few, it's not all, of realtors and insurance agents, but a few of them tell people that they don't need flood insurance. We need those folks to be afraid enough of the water to tell the people they're serving to be afraid of the water. And pinging off what Jamie said a little bit ago about evacuation zones and who's under evacuation. Look at what we do in the Weather Service. Now, we do it for water, for flash flood warnings and so forth, but we have tornado warnings and severe thunderstorm warnings and so forth. But wouldn't it be great if there was a similar dissemination mechanism for who's under an evacuation. You have the evacuation zones already mapped out. I would love to be able to show on television, here's this evacuation zone that has just been called for voluntary, this evacuation zone has been called for mandatory, goes in effect at what time, and point to it like we do a tornado warning. So there's so many things that we can be doing. And again, what are those evacuation zones primarily for? For water, for storm surge. So there's just so much more we can do for water. And I think it's because people just aren't afraid enough of it.
Mine's pretty generic, you know, just the outlook for the future, and it's amazing how if you look at you know, I know we talk so much about the cone, but if you look at the forecast cone from like 2000 to now, it's amazing how every single year it's making progress. But I feel like there still is a lot of room for growth, and even with our computer models, I think granted it was an anomaly, but it still happened. Hurricane Otis, and what happened with Otis? How the models did not pick up on the rapid intensification like it did. It went from a tropical storm to a Category 5, and it hit a metro area, hit a big area. And that was a part of Mexico that has never seen something to that caliber, and the devastation from the high-rise condos and how they weren't reinforced like a Miami and the type of codes that they had in place. So, and that was an anomaly from the models, but it still happened. And I'm looking forward to the future of preventing situations like that from happening, and how these models will get smarter and they will get even better with track and intensity in the years to come. That's what I'm excited about, and that's what I'm looking forward to. And granted, they have come a long way, incredible gains over the past 2 decades, but Otis was a case where it's not perfect, and there still is room for growth.
Absolutely.
Looking ahead to the future, I'd love to see this whole topic of resilience just continue. It has grown in 25 years, but to see it to continue to grow and grow and grow, and what I mean by that, even more people in the room and joining the movement, you know, that Leslie and Flash and many others have been a part of, but to see it to continue to grow, and with that messaging so it reaches policymakers, decision makers, and understanding that in the long run, it's what we have to do, because things are not going to get any less expensive when there's damage from a natural hazard. And that all of this information amongst, you know, this growing community would then get to the public, get to the folks, the homeowners, business owners, and have the education outreach be effective to give them those actionable things that they can do to be ready for the next storm.
Very good. Erica?
I think for me, what I would like to see over the next 25 years, I kind of grew up in the age of social media, communication. It's changing rapidly. And we have so many tools in our hand that I think, for example, if we couldn't go on air very quickly and there's a Category 5 hurricane making landfall, or like in Otis's instant, you know, wasn't in the forecast and it strengthened rapidly. Using tools like TikTok Live, there's a lot of community on there, not just from the US, but you know, around the world, using those kinds of tools to be able to give that information fast. And you know, I encourage everybody to go on social media. And I've been asking people here at the conference, where do you get your source of information? Most of them say, some say they don't watch TV anymore, too. And so, you know, hopefully within the next couple of years, people use the tools that are at hand. You know, I was hesitant at first using these kinds of tools. I know it seems a little scary putting yourself out there, but I think it's super useful, especially for important information, like you said, after a hurricane. Those people are hungry for information, using those kinds of tools to educate the communities, not just in English, but also in Spanish.
Yeah, and I think all very good. The group up here, you know, that people are looking for a trusted source, right? When things are really critical, they really want information, and they want to know it's trusted information, and basically tell us what to do and help us. And I think all these are great points. So very, very good. Do we have time for questions, Leslie?
We do, and you guys can. Am I? Hot mic? Nope. Oh, I have to turn it on. That's me. How about now?
We got you.
Okay. All right. So Jamie challenged us to make sure we always talk about success. So I'm going to recount a little success from personal observation and experience in terms of our success in messaging the linkage between severe weather and things like earthquakes and building codes and different outcomes as a result. So in Max's happy birthday video, he talks about how his retirement vested. And in 2004, when we started working together, he started talking about building codes, and he got a call from DC, and they said, stop it. It is not your job to talk about building codes or this, whatever that mitigation stuff is, cut it out. And he said, no, I'm going to do it anyway. And because of John Zarella and CNN, we told the tale of two homes. The old 1961, where the fridge blew out in the back wall and ended up in, all the people on that street crawled through glass, to the 2001 home that was intact. And because of that, they lived. In fact, Rick just had them on air, talking about the peace of mind as we rebuilt that resilient home and all the successive storms in those years. But since that time, there's convergence. And as you guys are talking, we're planning for our next huddle. We need to bring our expert community together with our weather expert community, because fast forward to 2001, David Pravat from UF called me, I think it was 10 o'clock at night. They had just finished the preliminaries on the Tuscaloosa outbreak. And he was very emotional because of his passion, and he said, Les, if they had had a building code, those kids wouldn't have died. But we can't say that yet, right? It's a very difficult linkage to make because it has all kinds of issues surrounding that. So when Joplin happened, we took the learning from Dr. Pravat and Mark Levitan and all the others, understanding that the reason we can build to withstand tornadoes is because most tornado damage is not generated by the 4 and 5. It's the 0, 1, and 2, which because of hurricanes, we know how to prevent. So we did a huge story with Reuters. It went across the country and everywhere with headlines, and it said, we can build to withstand most tornadoes. Guess what happened? I got a text, I won't say from whom, dear friend, collaborative meteorology partner, and said, Les, wow, it's a little soon to be saying that. It's a little early. And that's something that is changing, okay? But that has, I think, traditionally been part of the challenge. It's a very sensitive, difficult thing to tell people who have just lost their home. Wow, you didn't have to lose your home. A handful of nails more in the roof deck. So we've been, that balancing act, and the way we've overcome it, after Hurricane Michael, worked with the Washington Post, front page, above the fold, color picture of 5 Habitat for Humanity homes that survived in the path of the 5. Affordable, resilient, intact homes. And I think, you know, USA Today called us before Irma and said, what's going to happen? And the same with Ian. And so we're moving the conversation to the pre-storm phases. We're making the predictions. They're not hard to make. Better building code homes are going to fare better, and those people are going to be safe if they're elevated. But it's been a very tender walk. But thanks to the linkage and the work with you guys and your willingness to have the resilience conversation and find solutions, and we're working on being better at the visual part. Amy, you're right. That's why you got to go see Eric in the lab. But I just wanted to share that because there are successful stories about this, and in many cases, they don't only educate the public, they move public policy. Sometimes our building code progress, you know, we walk baby step, and then we have a big leap. Guess why? Because of a disaster. Right? So I just can't emphasize enough how important all of you are to this conversation, because you're the cool kids. Not that my engineers aren't cool, right? We pride ourselves on the geek factor, but making this every day for normal people and demonstrating that linkage. So wanted to share that success, and then I want to kind of recapture one of the key questions we wanted to have today, because we do have time for questions. This is another meteorology engineering kind of offset question. So Idalia Tower measurements on the ground due to terrain and roughness did not hit the high numbers that came out in the forecast before the storm, because those are coming in the air. understanding they're measured differently for very good reasons, but we get that. You know, the number in the code is different, a wind speed. So what do we do with the public to help the public? Dr. Gurley, who you had an email from, Kurt Gurley from UF, one of our partners. He's like, people think they went through, and you know, Matt just talked about how narrow it is. They do think they went through a strong Cat 3. Mm-hmm. And that's going to dictate their behavior in the future. So Jim, we kind of planted you on here because some of your work is in this, you know, the wind speed on the ground, the wind speed in the air. So if we can we dive into that just a little bit more if anyone has any thoughts, because the public doesn't get it. And they may be making bad decisions. And is that just something we add to the conversation up front? And we just start educating them, hey, what the Hurricane Hunter aircraft are measuring is not necessarily, which doesn't mean it's any less bad. I don't know the answer, but we wanted you guys to kind of start it, and then we'll keep working it this year until we get it figured out.
I can jump in.
So, go ahead. Yeah, I had a graphic on there, and it passed through, and it went off the screen. We can put it back on again just to show you some of these differences. Now, this graphic is really simple because it only shows the difference between the Hurricane Center advisory at landfall and then the highest wind gust in blue that was observed at any station, and then the sustained wind with that station in red. And so you can see that if you think about it, the gusts are going to be causing the damage. You know, the repeated impacts on buildings by the gusts makes a big deal. And so you can see that most of the hurricanes are, you know, show a higher advisory wind speed. That's a sustained wind speed than what we reported. But again, if you look at Idalia, which is on the second from the right, I mean, it hit somewhere where there are almost no stations. I mean, it almost none at all. And of course, you have power problems that take out some stations, and you have other issues that get in the way. You know, I could do the same thing with surge and probably be worse. You know, the only thing that saves us is we can do the post-storm analysis and then see what there is. It's not so easy with wind. Mm-hmm. And many of these places are inaccessible. So, but there are a few hurricanes where the reported gusts are higher. Irma's a good example. There was 130 mile an hour wind gust in Marco Island. There was a report of 140 in Naples. And it was not that far from the airport, which only hit hurricane force wind gust. And yet that small difference, I was talking about this nuance, there's a lot of structure in hurricanes that are unresolvable and can cause the wind to exceed expectations. So I think you can think about this and understand the landscape, but it's oversimplified here. What we really need to do is try to encompass and embrace that nuance and then convert those wind speeds to impacts using engineering analysis. We have databases of building codes. We have databases of the building stock that's out there, the residences. A little tougher for mobile homes, manufactured homes, because we don't have that. They tend to move sometimes. For the more permanent structures, however, we do. You know, maybe that's where the research needs to go, is to really work on that conversion. From wind speeds, adjust it to where the buildings are, you know, what kind of environment those buildings are in, and then talk about what's the potential impacts based on what those buildings and how they were built. And maybe that gets us to a space here that provides something that's even more useful than what we have. And by the way, it's not just wind. Surge is another one, because we have very few observations of very critical components that affect buildings. We focus on depth, but it's also the current velocity, wave actions that hit buildings, and also the potential for debris. For example, on San Carlos Island, I looked at house to house over there, and there was one unfortunate house that was the recipient of a 60-foot yacht that came in and made its way through at the expense of this poor house that was a wood frame house. And, you know, so that house really took it on the chin, and it wasn't the only source of large debris. There were many boats coming across from Fort Myers Beach into San Carlos Island, which caused more damage than already the bad damage that was there. So it would be good to account for these potential things. May not be able to do that on a forecast. You can't forecast which house is going to get hit by that yacht. But I think we can talk about these vulnerabilities that are located where people live.
Jimmy, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I was going to touch on the aircraft observations since Leslie mentioned it. Okay, so I was a hurricane specialist back in the day, before the internet. And anybody have any guesses on what was the hardest thing to learn as part of that job? Rick knows, but interpreting the aircraft information. 2.5 years of focus, dedicated, hardcore training, and I still wasn't comfortable with that aircraft information. That gives you a sense of just how difficult it is. And by law, we have to make it freely available, visible. My point is that's probably not the information that an untrained person, even if they happen to have a degree in meteorology, should be jumping to all sorts of conclusions and saying all sorts of things. So there's that part, there's a responsibility factor, and then there's the other part, sample size, exposure, elevation, create deltas in situ observations that will allow people to jump to wrong conclusions. We talked about how a hurricane changes dramatically in the horizontal. They also change dramatically in the vertical, substantially. Rick, what is it, one category for every?
You go up about 25 floors, you find yourself another category in terms of the strength of the sustained winds, never mind the gusts. Yeah.
So Leslie's point's a good one. There's a science measuring component of this that leads people to different conclusions, but there's also a responsibility, handling data responsibly, that we have to work on too.
And there's a tremendous scale issue here in terms of what the numbers in a Hurricane Center advisory are representing. You're not going to represent the winds of a tornado spawned by the hurricane. You're not going to represent an eye wall mesovortex. You're not going to represent the gustiness in a complex terrain environment or an urban environment with high rises. And you're not going to represent the different altitudes that the winds could be impinging upon structures at. You read the definition of what the maximum sustained wind is. It also has all kinds of information about how long is the averaging period and what's the altitude of the observation and what's the representativeness of that relative to the whole storm. So there's all kinds of issues. And so that's why the Hurricane Center advisories and post-event best track data are going to be inherently limited because they are painting a very big, broad picture on a particular scale. And there's a good reason why there isn't a forecast product from the Hurricane Center detailing what the winds are going to be when the system comes on land. And again, for reasons we've already talked about, lack of observations, the details of what can happen on a very small scale, it's really hard to, even after the fact, after long, careful analysis, to back out what happened wind-wise or water-wise at any particular location, even though I think we all recognize the need to do that. But it is a difficult road to hoe, and I would say from a funding perspective, we need more observation sites over water, on land, but I think, at least when I was director, I still had to make the case for why we needed the aircraft out there in the first place, to get the data, to warn people before we know exactly what's going to happen. So to get the funding, to have data for after the fact will be just as difficult, if not more so.
Unless there's AI, and then AI will paint the picture of the world.
Unless
it will
it
take the data
hallucinates.
from the aircraft, and it will give us the storm in full color before it actually happens someday.
There you go. AI is going to solve everything, right?
From the George Jetson school of thought.
Well, great way to finish up. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for being here. Fantastic.
Mark.
So, yeah, really awesome. Looking forward to next year. It'll be a bigger stage next year. So, yeah, I think Leslie, did you want to come up? Yeah, it'd be great.
Oh,
yes.
I think you and I are in the middle, so I think we're opposite. Yeah, I think we're opposite.
you want to come in the middle? Come on in here, Leslie. Come on.
Yeah, come on, Leslie.
Come on.
Back up.
See you in person.
All right, everybody, big smiles in 3, 2, 1.
Follow MyRadar on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Download MyRadar on iOS, Android, Amazon Alexa, Xbox, and Windows.